Welcome to Dr. B Music Theory. Thanks again for all the great comments and questions. I try to answer your questions either by responding to your comments or by making videos like these, but I have quite a backlog. And so today is Andrew FM's day. Andrew left me a bunch of questions, 3 questions, over the summer, and we're almost to 2018. I figured let's try to get some of these off the plate. And for those of you whose questions I haven't answered, I'm really going to try hard to get to those as soon as possible. So let's get started with Andrew's questions. His first question was a question for based on Lesson 12, the Voice Leading 102, where he wrote, any tips on when to bring in and out different voices based on the time in composition? Should all 4 voices come in at once and stay present, etc.? Well, that's a great compositional question. It's not quite a music theory question in the sense that there's a right or wrong answer to that. It's somewhat going to be dependent on what you're trying to achieve in the music. What does the text say? So if you're dealing with text in terms of voices and we're using the literal sense of the word voice, what does the text say? What are you trying to communicate in that passage? If we're talking about voice in the more general sense, let's say like in a fugue or some other instrumental work, again, what is the method of construction is going to really determine on how you can do it. So the quick answer is you could have all voices come in at the same time. You could have them come in one at a time. The best way to answer that question is to look back at the masters and their music and see what they did and see why they did certain introduction of voices for certain pieces. So I'm going to pull up some examples here. The first piece is from the Renaissance, a piece by Luca Marenzio, and the text starts with, alone and pensive, the deserted fields I measure with steps deliberate and slow. So as a composer, Luca Marenzio had to say, how am I going to set this text to music? And in this case, he decided on a 5-voice texture. And he starts off and he brings them in one by one. Well, that makes sense because alone, you start with one voice alone. Instead of all 5 voices, start with one voice alone. This, by the way, comes from Italian madrigal style. And they made use of things called word painting. Word painting is where the notes in the music tries to imitate or illustrate what the words are. So this is very literal. When it says, the text says alone, Marenzio uses one singular voice. And then slowly, with measured steps, adds another voice, and then another voice, and another voice. So you hear something that sounds a little bit, and I'll play just the beginning of it for you all. The solo voice, and then the next voice comes in with, and then our third voice comes in, and at that point we have our 3 voices. And as the music unfurls, you add an additional voice until you have a very full 5-voice texture. So in the case of Marenzio, the kind of the tip is use the text to inform the way the music is written. But let's continue, because that is just one example. Let's take a look at a Bach fugue. Now this is instrumental, so when we say voices, we're talking really more melodies. The fugue is a compositional structure that almost by definition you have one voice, then you add another voice, a third voice, a fourth voice. Sometimes you can have a 3-voice fugue, but 4 voices is the most common. So in this example by Bach, he starts with the tenor voice, and I'm just going to play what's called the subject, which is overlapping and starting a little bit before that subject ends in the tenor voice, you have that same subject come in the alto voice. It's at a different pitch level. So typically the first statement of the subject is at the level of the tonic, the key of the 1. The second is in the dominant, and then it goes back to 1, and then back to the dominant. So tonally you have that idea. So the alto voice then comes in with which is that subject at a different pitch level, at the key of the dominant, with a few minor variations to make it work, because the tenor voice continues. So when we start, we have one voice all by itself. The alto joins. Now we have two voices, the tenor and the alto. Then the soprano joins, which means we have 3 melodies going all on at the same time. And then the bass enters. We got 4 voices and a contrapuntal texture. The soprano, you can then hear, goes like this. And then the bass. And there's a little bit of overlap. The end of one overlaps a little bit with the beginning of the second. So here we have Bach staggering his entrances. Somewhat similar to the Marenzio, where you have one voice enters, then another, and until you have the full texture. Let's look at another example. This is also by Bach. This is from a chorale. And in this example, before we look at the music, again, let's look at the text, because this has a text, and try to understand, as a composer, what do you have at your resources? And the texture is one of those resources. So with Andrew's question of how should the voices come in all at once, should they come in one at a time, what's the length of time between their entrances, all of this is very much dependent on what you want to communicate. And as a composer, you should utilize this as many different options as possible. Have voices come in one at a time, have them come in all at the same time. What is the different musical and emotional effects of that? You'll see that in the Marenzio, the one voice at a time, the second voice is added almost immediately. And then the third voice pretty quickly, and then it takes a little while before you get those fourth and fifth voices. That makes sense, having one voice for a real long time, it can be very empty. The Bach example, you see that we had a measured, few number of measures before we then had the next voice come in. Let's look at the text here from St. Matthew's Passion. Again, a passion is the story of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ from the Bible. So the text is, this is a rough translation, and from the 6th hour on, there was a darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried aloud. Jesus then makes his cry. The evangelist, who functions as a narrator, says, "That is, my God, wherefore hast thou me forsaken? But there were some who stood about there, who when they heard that, spake thus." And then you have a chorus come in. "He calleth for Elijah." And then the evangelist, the narrator, comes in again, "And straightway one of them ran forth under him, took a sponge, and filled it with vinegar, and placed it upon a reed, gave him to drink. The others said, however," and then you have the chorus come in, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And the evangelist finally says, "But Jesus cried again aloud, and died." This is like the big dramatic point in this story. And you then have a chorale. And the chorale often functions as kind of a reflection on what's happening in the story. Almost like what's the moral of the story. And the text is, "When once I must depart, do not depart from me. When I must suffer death, then stand thou by me. And so Bach now has to decide, how do I have the voices? Do I have the voices come in one after another, like I did with my fugue, or like Marenzio does with his madrigal, or do I have all the voices come in together? And in this case, that point in the story, you have this kind of this sadness, this weightiness, and having all the voices come in exactly together really helps reinforce that emotionally. So if we then take a look at that music and see exactly what Bach did with that, you can see he sets it in a minor key, all the voices come in, it has some wonderful dissonances and rubs there to show the tension. And so my answer to Andrew is to really look at a variety of different composers, how they use that. In general, if you want a harmonious sound where everything feels like it's blended together, you have your voices come in all together and you maintain that texture. Again, this is a question about texture. The fugue has a different kind of formula for the beginning. Italian madrigals are a great way to study form, looking at Marenzio, Carlo Gesualdo, or Renaissance composers in general, people like Josquin de Prez, how they'll take 4 voices or 5 voices and they won't have them all the time nonstop. That could get very boring, so they'll break out into duos, trios, smaller groupings within that larger 5 or 4 voice texture. So variety of texture is something that's very useful as a composer to experiment with. Now, that was Andrew's first question. It took me a long time to answer that one, so since I'm on a roll here, I want to answer another question. He asked me on a question for lesson 24, which was about non-chord tones. He asked, is it a pedal tone if it's a common tone of the previous and the following chords, but also a part of the current chord, or is just an inversion then? So the answer is, it's just an inversion. But let's take a quick look at that and see how that would play out in our example. Because for something to be a non-chord tone, by definition, it can't be in the chord. And one of the things a lot of new students to music theory, one mistake they do is they'll just call things a non-chord tone if it has the right preparation and resolution, and ignore whether that's actually a part of the chord. They'll miss that. So that's an easy mistake to make. So let's say we have, and we'll put this in treble clef here, and we'll just say that we start with a G major triad, and we'll have a G down here. We'll call, this is what we're prepping to be our pedal tone, right? And then if we then go, oh look, we're gonna, this is a G major triad, here's a C major triad, and then we're gonna go back to a G major triad, and this G extends the whole time. This G means that this is in root position, this will be in second inversion, going back to root position. At this point right here, this is not a non-chord tone, it's still part of the C major triad. So just because in the previous chord the G is in the bass, prepared by common tone, resolved by common tone, this chord cannot include what you want your pedal tone to be. So what other options could you have? Well, you got to pick a chord that really doesn't have a G in it. So what about a D major triad? There's no way we can think about that as having a G in it. That would be an example of how you could have a pedal tone, because this point on this chord, I'm going to highlight this for you all, the note G is definitely not in the D major triad. Now, let me think about other ways that you could possibly get confused. Well, you look at the notes here and you say, well, there's a G, there's an F sharp, there's a D, and there's an A. And sometimes the tricky part is figuring out which one's the non-chord tone. I mean, I can tell you, well, the G is the non-chord tone, it's a D major triad. But is there any other option here that could be confusing? Now, sometimes you might look and say, well, the F sharp and A start, that's a third relation. G, there's a no B, but D, F sharp, maybe it's a G major 7th thing, but the A is replacing the B. Whenever you get into those points, it starts getting so complicated. Your ear doesn't hear it like that. Your ear hears the simplest thing. So it is most definitely a G pedal tone, which would sound something like this. If we play that, right? So G major triad, D major triad, with G still in the bass, back to the G major triad. If we do G, which is the G to the C, it's a neighbor 6/4 chord. It's a pedal 6/4 chord. So it's just changing the inversion. It's saying, oh yeah, it's 1 4 6 4 1. Now you'll notice that I just used the word pedal to describe the 6/4 chord, because there is a similarity with the pedal tone. So there's a difference between a pedal tone, which is a non-chord tone, and a pedal 6/4, where the pedal 6/4, and if you listen to my lesson on 6/4 chords, second inversion, you can get a really good, more in-depth explanation of how that works. But there is some similarity there. So Andrew had a great question, and hopefully that clarifies it. Andrew has one more question that I wanted to make sure to answer. He writes, if you had a C major chord in the key of C, and the melody went from C to B to C, would you consider that a non-chord tone or a C7? So let me write that out again so we can all visualize it. We're in the key of C. We have a C major chord. We have a melody note that goes C, B, C. Okay? Well, first off, for a C7, which is, would it be a C7? A C7 is a major triad with a minor seventh, which spelled would be C, E, G, B flat. So there's no way it can be a C7. It doesn't have the right note. What Andrew probably meant is, would it be a major 7? Could it be C, E, G, B natural? Could this B natural, could we basically say this is C, this is a C major 7, back to C? Would that be a way that it could be analyzed? No. The answer is no. So well, actually, let me back off. Let me backpedal just a little bit on that. If the melody note B is moving fairly quickly, no way are you going to hear it. You're going to hear it as a lower neighbor tone. You're going to hear it as a non-chord tone, as a lower neighbor. Now, why did I backpedal? Well, what if it was longer? What if you spent a lot longer on, and then you spent a long time on the B natural? So you could make it sound like a C major 7, not a C7, but a C major 7, if you spent a long enough time rhythmically on the B natural to make it sound like it's just staying there for a while. So to answer that question, it's going to depend on the rhythm. In general, it's going to be heard as a non-chord tone, as a neighbor tone specifically. Another reason that makes sense is if you listen to my lesson on 7th chords, one of the primary rules of the 7th is that the 7th is resolved down by step. So we would expect that B natural in this case to continue moving down to an A. Now, yes, you could, by reinforcing and playing it over for an extended period of time, you could make it sound like it's a major 7 that then resolves up and doesn't do what's expected. But keep in mind, it would be unexpected. We expect the 7th to resolve down by 7th. So to make it sound good and deny that expectation, you have to do something special. And in this case, what I was suggesting is spending a lot of time rhythmically, a number of measures on the B natural, and then go back to the C. So if you don't do that, so let's back up. Let's say you don't resolve the 7th down as expected, and you don't spend any time to override that expectation, then what will happen is it will just not sound good. So keep in mind, these music theory rules will often give you something that sounds good. It's not a guarantee. You still have to use your ear. But these are the rules, these are the expectations of what the ear expects to hear. And if you follow the expectations, things will sound right. If you don't follow the expectation, then you have to be very, very careful. You have to do something different to allow for that exception to sound like it makes sense. Because if you just do it unaware, there's a good chance it's not going to sound good. And as someone becoming learning to become a composer or an arranger, you don't want to just accidentally be breaking all these rules, not doing it for any reason, not coming up with something that makes it make sense even though it's breaking the rule. Otherwise, what you're composing, what you're arranging, is just not going to make a lot of sense. It's going to sound very amateur. So I hope that clarifies a whole bunch of things. Andrew, thank you for your questions. Everybody else there, keep posting comments, keep asking questions. I promise I will keep working hard to answer them all. Thank you so much.